Good morning and welcome. Good morning, maybe good afternoon or good evening, because we have a pretty global audience today. Welcome to our web panel today, discussion around automated service vehicles at the Sidewalk and Kerb. My name is Jerry Boyer and I'm going to be your host for today. That's just a fancy way of saying I'm going to run the operation, but pretty soon I'm going to hand it over to Kevin, who I will introduce in a minute. Just before we get started, a couple of things that we're going to talk about today and that are important for you to know. First of all, people interact with a city at the Sidewalk and Kerb, and it's a really complicated place and a major asset for any city. Automation brings the need to have some rules and standards in place, and so that's really what we're going to be talking about today. So you are now in the webinar, and we will be handling questions a little bit later on. And the way that you ask a question is in the GoToWebinar control panel. There is a question area where you can type in your questions, and we'll ask those a little bit later on as we go. So what else can I tell you? I think that we're probably going to get started, and if there's questions, again, you know where to ask them. We are going to end in about an hour from now, so we're going to end right on time, and we're going to do our very best to answer all of your questions. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Kevin Borras as our moderator today. This is our second series in web panels for ISO Sidewalk and Kerb. And Kevin is the editor for Thinking Cities and Thinking Highways, UK publications with international circulations. He's also a frequent podcaster on Thinking Aloud and Inside Intertraffic. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jerry. Welcome, everybody. Yeah, we've got a good international audience, and we have an international panel from various different countries. So we just say hello rather than good afternoon. We don't want to be too specific. So whatever time of the day is, thank you for joining us. This will be a very informative hour, hopefully, and entertaining. A few things to mention before we go too far is that when you have a question for the panel, if you want to send the question to a particular panelist, put that in your question. But whatever you do, whatever you ask, if you can put your name and your affiliation into the panel, so Jerry and I can see who the question is, and when we can work out the best person to ask it. Otherwise, we could ask general questions. So if your question is general, we'll put it to everybody. Anyway, that's just a bit of housekeeping. So no further ado, we have a very, very esteemed panel. I'm going to welcome them all. So thanks everyone for joining us, first of all. And our first panelist is Ahmed Hashish. Ahmed is a systems engineer with the Future Mobility Network in Delft in the Netherlands. Ahmed, how are you doing?
Yeah, fine, Mr. Kevin. How are you?
Good, yes, very well, thank you. Thanks for joining us. We also have Peter Jones, OBE, who's Professor of Transport and Sustainable Development at University College London. Peter, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
Good.
Thanks, Kevin.
And thank you for joining us. And we also have joining us from Tallinn in Estonia, Andres Kõiva, who is the co-founder of Lumebot. Hi, Andres.
Hi, Kevin.
Thank you. And also joining us from Waterloo in Ontario, with the founder and CEO of SafeGround, Neluka Leanage. Hi, Neluka.
Hi, everyone.
And also, of course, without whom we wouldn't be here, Bern Grush, who is the Chief Information Officer of Harmonized Mobility and the project leader of ISO 4448, and the reason that we're here. So, Bern, shall we hand over to you first? Let's give the listeners / viewers, maybe some are listening if they haven't got a camera, a bit of a reminder of what we're here for and what this ISO standard that we're working on is here to achieve. What's the point of it? What's the goal of it? And the timeline, and what is the basic, what's the essence of this standard?
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin. I think all of us are acutely aware by now of the growing demands that are crowding out our curbsides, things like ride hailing and e-commerce and scooters and so on, all of these new technologies that are already invading an existing space. And we've just added social distancing to that as well. And even now, in some cases, and at least in Canada and in many other countries as well, we're starting to push restaurant tables out beyond the curb as well. So how do we manage this space as it becomes increasingly dynamic and increasingly crowded. And then what's going to happen, as we expect before too much longer, automated taxis in some cities and sidewalk delivery drones in yet other cities and so forth. And so too often we consider each of these modalities or technologies in isolation. The problem is that in each of these modalities and innovations, they all have different operators. They serve different purposes and they serve different population segments. The sidewalk and curb in our, this, as Jerry pointed out earlier, is one of our key social and commercial focuses, and we already have too many spatial constraints in all of these places. So as we add robotaxis and drones to these spaces, they'll still be mixed with manual vehicles and with humans, and it brings in safety issues, which I think Neluka is going to talk about a little bit as well. And so we're fast approaching an environment of humans and machines that we've never experienced before, this mixing of robots and machines in the same space. Most critically, we need consistent data definitions and a consistent body of real-time communication protocol to enable multiple operators, multiple manufacturers, multiple developers, multiple business associations, and multiple systems to collaborate for multiple activities for both people and goods happening in what are generally highly variable and constrained spaces that require human safety, the ability to conduct commerce, and to permit maintenance services. We're going to hear something about that from Andres as well. Trying to do all of that while maximizing urban livability all at the same time. And I know Ahmed and Peter can talk to some of those issues. Very, very complex problem. So as an example, what rules should apply in this new space? Will it be okay for robo-taxis to straddle bicycle lanes when boarding customers as taxis do today? Can we expect robo-taxis to cruise for parking as many of us do today? How will reservations for boarding and loading spaces be distributed and governed? And there's some companies working on that now, but how will that be done in a universal manner? How can we expect many fleets to be operated by many firms so that the ground control system will be critical? How many delivery drones will be permitted on the sidewalk at any given time slot? There's a very large number of logistics types questions like this for the sidewalk and curb as they become automated. And it's addressing these kinds of issues that's core to the standard that we're working on. And that's why we're appealing for stakeholder collaboration wherever we can find it through this series of panel discussions. Thanks.
Thank you, Bern. So if anyone's got any questions regarding what Bern has said, put those in the question box. Jerry and I will sort through them and we'll ask them. Of course, we probably won't get the chance to answer everybody's question or ask everyone's question, but we will be able to do something later on after the panel is finished, and we can put the questions to the individual panelists if they're okay with that. So if you don't get your question answered, apologies from the outset, won't always be possible. We'll do our best. Anyway, so thanks, Bern, for that. Let's start with Neluka. So your work is focused on safety in the kinds of space that we're talking about, the kind of space that the standard's addressing. And as Bern mentioned, we've got another player in the battle for sidewalk space. It's not just now robotic delivery vehicles and people walking. We've now got, because of the restrictions from COVID-19 and the social distancing, we have tables and chairs on the pavement for cafes and bars to stretch out and actually be able to use them. So they're being encouraged to use the space that we're talking about. So that space is already potentially crowded, potentially very busy. So how does this work together? In your work, are you approaching this as something that makes certainly very, very interesting, but is it riskier? Is there more danger now involved where there's humans and robotic vehicles and infrastructure and furniture? How's this work for you?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kevin, and I think you're right. I think it adds complications, that's for sure. It becomes a much more dynamic, complicated environment. So at SafeGround, we're on a mission to reduce crashes and conflicts between all different types of users, whether that's on the roads, in intersections, or on our non-motorized facilities like in the bike lanes, the sidewalks, and then the curb ramps. And our approach to this is by digitizing and predicting and alerting to those risks. So those risks could be, like you're saying, new types of tables, trip hazards, utility doors, all that kind of stuff. So, and you know, what's really happening is basically as we urbanize, there's just more demands for public spaces from a growing diversity of users. And on one hand, this is like really exciting. You know, there's been lots of downturns in the economies and cities over time, and now we're having a lot more activity in our public spaces. So that does increase the potential conflict between users. And when we consider that up to 90% of road crashes are due to driver error, this might be similar to autonomous machines. So on one hand, they hold promise to remove some of the errors, but it's expected that they'll still be liable for about 2/3 of the mistakes because they're programmed in a similar way like drivers and we're fallible. And, you know, so historically, sidewalks and curbs have been the exclusive domain of people, you know, pedestrians, wheelchairs, mobility carts, dogs. And like you mentioned with COVID, our existing spaces we see very clearly are just inadequate. They're too small, you know, too narrow, they've got lots of obstacles. So safety has improved over the years when we separate users, and we can look at examples around the world. There's car-free city centers, for example, but sometimes that model doesn't work. And so there's a shared streets approach out there, which you really slow down the speeds and you prioritize vulnerable users over motorized ones. So, you know, that's an existing model. So what happens when we add new autonomous users that don't have the intuitive capacity that humans have and to adjust in real time into all the infinite behaviors that humans exhibit? Where do we add them in the crowded space? And will people really be accommodating? You know, there's sort of stories of people kicking them if they get frustrated. And do we prioritize human mobility and access over the autonomous mobility? Will separation by speed or time be required? And where might those shared space models really work? So from my perspective, the standard that we're talking about today is really critically important. It will define a minimum set of contexts and rules that will govern safe autonomous behaviors. And I consider this type of infrastructure our most precious infrastructure. So I think it's very important.
Excellent, thank you for that. But it's getting more from our perspective, working in the sector, it's getting more interesting. But from the public's perspective, as you said, there's more stuff. There's more of an obstacle course, especially if you're disabled, you're in a wheelchair, and there's now less space. You can't just come off the pavement onto the street and back on again if there's no ramp. I mean, it's getting difficult. Well, we'll discuss that again. That's part of what the standard is all about. So thanks for that, Neluka. Excellent stuff. Ahmed, can we come to you now? So Ahmed is based in Delft, in the Netherlands. A couple of weeks ago, Ahmed showed me a live video. Thanks for that, of a project that you're working on with an autonomous vehicle, like an autonomous shuttle bus. Correct. We can't talk about where that was. Not allowed to mention this is for legal reasons, but it was very interesting, and it's kind of next level stuff. Now, made me think about making these things smaller. So this is for maybe up to 10, 12 people. Could these work for 2 or 3 people, or 1 person, or for goods? So, can you tell us about currently what you're working on? Talk about that project as much as you're allowed to, and what's the thinking of your organisation, the Future Mobility Network, regarding how to manage what I'm going to call the sidewalk of the future. And it's not that far into the future. It's now.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. And actually here at the Future Mobility Network, we actively work with all these automated robot systems. And yeah, we as Future Mobility Network are really a knowledge and realization company. We consider ourselves as the Ministry of Breakthrough, as we call it. And we really want to implement these type of mobility and robots, what people consider as a mobility of the future. We really want to implement today, and we see that it's possible. And we want to learn from this innovative form of mobility. And actually, we have already successfully done this for automated people movers. Well, Kevin, you already mentioned one. This is confidential, so let's keep it confidential. But we've been doing so since 2015. And that was the first automated people mover on the public road. And since then, actually, we have already implemented 3 additional ones. And even though we don't know everything beforehand, because these are very challenging projects, very big projects, fairly complex, we still try to conquer all these different challenges with our learning by doing approach. And we do that in collaboration with many different partners. So one of the things, or one of the institutions that we work with is really the Delft University of Technology. actually we are here sitting in the backyard of the TU Delft. And they have, of course, a big reputation globally, and yeah, they can help us with answering all these different questions that we have. And we do this the same actually with governments, with ministries, with the industry. We try to use this triple helix form for it, and every automated robot system that we have, we believe it is actually ready to be implemented. And even though perhaps it's not immediately usable as a business model, we try to do that in small steps and try to take everybody with us, because we know we want to try and think out of the box, but we know that it is difficult and we know it is scary, but we try to take everybody with us because we have this vision for the future and mobility of the future, and we try to take everybody with us in this transportation problem and in challenges that we have. And actually the same principle that I just mentioned for automated people movers, we actually do that for all our implementation projects, and also the sidewalk drones. And actually at the moment, we are actually preparing 2 sidewalk drone pilots, one in the south of the Netherlands, really on the campus terrain of University of Applied Sciences, where we want to implement an automated sidewalk drone robot and to transport goods between those different buildings that you have at the campus terrain. And it's really to learn from it. And actually it's also going to drive mixed traffic. So there are a lot of challenges coming, not just from a simple project that's relatively small scale, but yeah, challenges like, is the feasible business model? Is the technology ready? How does it interact with other users? How does it behave in mixed traffic? All these type of questions, we don't immediately have an answer for it, but we try to answer them and see everything that we think of and come with whether that can be validated and verified. And the same actually type of project is also being used for a boulevard in Scheveningen, which is also here in the Netherlands, which is the use of an automated waste disposal robot. And this waste disposal robot is really like a last mile dynamic moving trash bin, which drives actually towards you. And if you have something trash, litter, whatever you want to throw away, and you see that the trash bin is just way too far for you, you wave to the robot and the robot comes to you, which makes it really nice. And this robot comes to you, it opens this lid, you can throw away your trash and it says thank you actually and drives away again. So we try to think of these type of challenges, we try to think of it in different ways and different from how the usual crowd and people think of it. And that's why we call ourselves the Ministry of Breakthrough, of course. And yeah, Bern, you already mentioned the sidewalk delivery drones, but we try to consider the sidewalk drones not only as delivery drones, but also service drones. I mean, you can also imagine that, let's say, your waste bins, that is type of delivery, but also type of a service robot. And the same can be said about, let's say, cleaning the streets, security robots, and all these different types of robots. And they're all going to be making use of the sidewalk, or how to implement them and how to let them interact with all these different road users. Well, that is also a good question for us. That's something that we try to learn, but we always try to do it with the learning by doing approach.
Excellent, thank you. I like the idea of, so it's a trash can that kind of it invites you to throw rubbish away. So when I was in Japan a few years ago, there was this is a strange conversation to have. There's a public toilet, and when you walked past it, the toilet said, "Hello, would you like to use the toilet?" And you think, okay.
Well, I'm not so happy about the idea of going to the toilet in public, but sure.
Well, it's covered. It's not just in the middle of the street. I mean, it's a proper covered building, but humans are suggestible. So if the trash can is saying, "Use me, put your trash in," then people will do it. Humans are suggestible people, and it's just you just didn't want to use the toilet. I think, yeah, go on then, and then you have to pay, and then it's a very clever way. I just thought it was an interesting way of autonomous bathrooms. Yep. Peter, coming to you now. I'm moving away from the subject of toilets, although I think it was actually relevant. So Peter is leading an EU project called MORE, which is multimodal optimization for road space in Europe. MORE focuses on the dynamic allocation of street space, which again is what we're talking about as being very crowded and becoming more and more crowded in urban areas anyway. So Peter, what do you think is the main challenge that you can address looking at the future sidewalk within your project?
Well, thank you, Kevin. As people have said already, more and more things are starting to take place on the sidewalk. So it's something that we will need to pay a lot more attention to in the future. perhaps as a way of comparison, we could start off comparing it with a traffic lane. We know a lot about moving traffic, and we've done lots of simulation of autonomous vehicles. But actually, although that'll take us so far, the footway or sidewalk is much more complicated in at least 4 respects. First of all is in terms of the width. A width for a traffic lane is pretty constant. The width of a sidewalk or footway is very variable for 2 reasons. One, because older parts of cities, at some places it can go down to 1 meter. In other places it may be 2 or 3 meters wide. So it's a variable thing, not a fixed width. But on top of that, there are lots of things on that footway, which we call street furniture, whether it's street lamps or whether it's traffic signs or whether it's seating, whatever, which vary the effective width available for movement as you go along. So that's one great complication. And it's not as though we can map those, because if somebody's sitting on the seat, it needs a lot more space than if the seat's just there unoccupied. Secondly, if we look at movement along the footway, then we've got quite a range of uses there. We've got people on foot, maybe walking very quickly, maybe some are on their mobile phone not paying much attention, some are walking quite slowly, maybe elderly. And on top of that, we've potentially got a number of wheel transport modes. At the moment, we've got things like elderly scooters and things, and then now we're talking about already starting to have these sidewalk drones, and in the future we're talking about snowplows and sweeping and things like that. So that's much more complicated than dealing with the traffic lane. The third thing is that the movement on the footway is not only bi-directional, so within the same space you've got 2-directional movement, unlike a traffic lane where each traffic lane by definition is one way, but on top of that you've got lots of transversal movement. So you've got movement of people and goods from the curbside into the buildings, which is cutting across. So not only is it 2-directional without clear division, you've got these cross movements as well. And finally, on top of that, footways support street activities. You know, a vibrant area is where you find people stopping, they're chatting to each other, they're window shopping, they're resting, whatever. And again, that adds to the richness of the mix, but the difficulty of actually managing that space. Now, at the moment, the way we do that is we do it informally, a bit like a shared space. We just maneuver around, we give way informally. But of course, with the growth in automated vehicles on the footway, then we're going to have to develop digital codes, and that's where this initiative, I think, is really important. And again, there, the challenges are much greater than a traffic lane. On a traffic lane, you're just dealing with moving traffic, and over time, we'll get to the point probably where all vehicles on traffic lanes are actually autonomous, so they can work to the same set of rules or speak to each other. But of course, on the footway, that'll never be the case, because the pedestrians will remain self-conscious and self-acting, and therefore won't behave with rules in the same way as an autonomous vehicle would. So very challenging, and I think this initiative is very apt at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. Okay, Andres, finally to you. Peter's already mentioned what you do. So your company, Lumebot, your machines are designed to clear snow from sidewalks and curbs, which I guess that means you're kind of very reliant on data in terms of where your bots can actually go, where it's possible to clear the snow. But if there's other traffic, other foot traffic or wheelchairs or tables or whatever, you've really got to know exactly where to go, so you don't add to the traffic, if you like. So in terms of parked vehicles and obstructions, how do you work around that? And how do you think an international standard like this one, 4448, is actually going to make your life easier and therefore the lives of everybody else simpler?
Thanks, Kevin. And actually, we are developing a year-round street cleaning service. So while providing year-round street cleaning, there are some things you might consider, that the winter cleaning and the cleaning in other seasons, they're totally different. For winter cleaning, when the snowstorm hits the city, their street cleaning service robot, they need to have the first priority to clear up the sidewalk to make it usable for other users of the sidewalk. In other seasons, the street sweeping tasks, they can be done during winter time, and there are plenty of room to do that chore. The sidewalks will be always the mix of pedestrians, autonomous machines, manually controlled machines, and this is the multi-vendor system. And the standard helps us to communicate with a central database to set priorities of the sidewalk usage. And there might also be a sidewalk usage tax that you can use for buying for your autonomous vehicles the priorities that might enable for you to provide better service. In our case, our street cleaning robots, they need to empty and fill their load. For that, we are going to use hauling vehicles for loading purposes. And those hauling vehicles, they might be autonomous or manually controlled, but either way, they need to have determined time and parking place to do the loading chores. And also the standard needs to clarify the situation when the robot gets broken, maybe in the middle of the sidewalk. And to reduce the opportunities for congestions, we need to determine the time limits, how long can they stay in the middle of the sidewalk, or how will they need to pull to the side during the malfunctions.
Excellent. So a lot to consider for everybody. Everyone's got different perspectives, working on different aspects of this sector, but you've all got the same things to consider. So that's all from the panel for now. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. I hope you, the listeners and viewers, have got something out of that. And if you haven't, you've got questions, please send us your questions. Jerry has been monitoring the questions. He's nodding. There are questions. That's always a very good sign. But if you haven't sent your question yet, please do put your name and your affiliation so we can attribute the question to you. But before we go on to the public questions, have the panel got any questions for the rest of the panel? Well, a good start. Yes, Andres has one.
Yeah, I have a question. I have a question to Neluka. So the behavior of a pedestrian and a manually driven e-scooter, for example, they are pretty unpredictable. How it is possible to limit their usage of sidewalks when we have prioritized the work for autonomous municipal vehicles? Or how do we ensure that the pedestrians and e-scooter users, they're following the rules? Or is it even necessary?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, you know, as a active pedestrian myself, a lot of pedestrians don't like to be controlled. So there's always this element, like Peter mentioned, that we're very much sort of willful. I think that's going to be probably the biggest challenge. But I would see the direction of this going more toward, you know, some sort of separation or distinction between different zones, for example, on the sidewalk. I think we can look to some examples like in London, UK. They even have separated a fast walking lane from sort of the slower street activity type pedestrian movements. So you can already see in congested areas like that, there's experiments for that. Yeah, and in terms of, I guess, there's sort of a really strong communication approach that could be used. I mean, if you can imagine that if you knew that your sidewalk was going to be plowed, hey, first off, that's really exciting because sidewalks are usually not plowed, at least not in Canada. So if you knew that, you know, you could obviously go to the other side of the sidewalk, right? So I think there's sort of some really good communication opportunities here. And then lastly, I think what we're doing at SafeGround is we're trying to remove some of the unpredictability. So there are some situations that they may seem unpredictable to the untrained eye, but there are definitely behaviors where, like if you have, like Peter sort of mentioned, if you had loading and unloading zones, that's going to be likely that a truck's going to pull up there and a delivery human is going to then go to the store, right? So there are some things like elements like that where you can start to build in an awareness of those kinds of patterns, if you will, that might be seen along a sidewalk. So we're trying to actually locate those and see if we can build any prediction around those spaces.
Okay. Answer your question, Andres? Excellent. Okay, Peter.
Yeah, just to comment on what Neluka said, mentioned e-scooters. I mean, I think this is a plus, because at the moment pedestrians are not very happy having scooters whizzing around the footways and so on. But of course, then you could geofence them so that if they came off the carriageway onto the footway, they'd no longer be powered. So there could be some safety things from that point of view, potentially.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I've got a question for whoever wants to answer this. It sounds like a trivial thing. It's not about the toilets, but it sounds like an odd question. But I was discussing the idea of autonomizing street robots or land drones, or whatever you want to call them, and how they're going to combine and integrate in pedestrian traffic. Where does that leave the unfortunate people who are homeless and sleep on the streets? How do they fit into the mix? Because you can't ignore those people because they're sadly there. So how do the bots, how do you fit them in? How do you sort of plug those people into the way that the system has to process data?
Well, in a way, I was mentioning street activities. Already people will stop and chat to each other, or somebody will stand there for a minute and just check their phone or something. So we've got to allow for the fact that people won't always be moving. People will be spending amounts of time from a few seconds to minutes or even hours if people are selling magazines or something. So I think it's something you have to recognise as part of the whole street activity, and recognise that's a legitimate use of the street as a place, not just as a channel for movement.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Anybody else got any other questions for panelists? Otherwise, we'll move on to Jerry in his new location. We do have questions from the audience. Jerry, do you want to shall we start?
Sure, Kevin. Very observant of you. I had to change locations. My internet connection was breaking down in my last location, so. I do have a couple questions, so I'm going to start. This one here says, as Neluka explained, the future of sidewalks and curbs is complicated. There we go. Commenting, any new standard cannot and should not be all things to all people. What is the panel's vision for ISO 4448? What can it realistically include, and what should not? And what should be out of scope? That's from Barry Kirk from Cavco in Ottawa, Canada.
Okay. Good question. Neluka, it was addressed to you. Will you start? If you can.
Well, I was going to think that Bern was maybe the best person to answer this, just because he's already delved into it. But I mean, I think that any kind of control of human behaviors is, I would expect, the most challenging piece. But yeah, there's going to be lots of activity, for example, at the curb, and I think that is a very particular area that does need proper management. Whether you have a cyclist lifting their bicycle onto the curb to lock up their bike, and then the delivery people, pedestrians stepping on and off, all of those kinds of activities, I think that could be better managed for sure. I think there's also a strong case for the actual ramps for getting down, say, to cross a road at the intersection level. So all of those slopes, I think, may also require some management. So we've had some cases where Delivery Bot has tried to approach that, and a wheelchair user is trying to go down that at the same time. So then there's a really strong conflict, but it's also a very dangerous type of conflict. So that obviously needs some working out. I think that would be a good case there. Yeah.
Ahmed, I come to you now because go on. Sorry, go on, Ben. It's your case.
I just want to add, Barry's question is absolutely very critical. So the standard, in a sense, the standard has to be able to enable, I underscore the word enable, all things to all people, but it can't do anything for anyone. In other words, the standard is about data and protocol.
Yeah.
A city council will say some things. A manufacturer will do other things to use that, so that the standard is an enabler. It doesn't answer it doesn't say, the standard doesn't say, that you can have, you will use a robotic snowplow on this sidewalk. It doesn't say you have to. It doesn't say it can run between 10 and 12. The standard doesn't say. The standard permits those statements to be made, or a manufacturer to provide services, or a city to say what's going, or a local business association say we don't want drones on our side, or we do want delivery drones, and so on. It's purely an enabler. It doesn't solve anything. It lets other organizations and governance and manufacturers and developers solve those problems. We're a long way from solving everything.
Yeah, Bern, actually I agree with that, and I think this standard helps different providers, I would say, and different stakeholders, if I can call them stakeholders, in its use, whether they're manually driven vehicles, robots, people with wheelchairs, you name it. The idea is that all gets integrated and there's a certain balance that it actually enables. And I think that is what the goal is, that people and also robots, there is a balance between the two. There's a balance with the use of the curb, there's a balance with the environment, and all those things are coming together. And actually also in the case of robots, robots are enablers for certain activities that we as humans cannot always provide. Either we don't have the resources, either we, for whatever reasons. And it's always, in my opinion, the robots or the enabling technology with respect to the environment. And the environment in this case is the robots, the road users, the pedestrians, wheelchairs, whatever, but also the environment and the curb itself.
Excellent. Okay, Andres, can I come to you with that? As your company manufactures exactly what we're talking about. So you're looking at snowplows, looking at street cleaning or street cleansing. There's a lot of different, I guess it's the same in principle. There's a lot of differences, a lot of subsections and subsectors to what you're doing in the same standard. So how are you guys approaching that?
So taking the use of robots, this should help the people or the citizens, and that's why the standard is helpful for everybody, because it helps the robotics part of the situation. When we have the different vendors who are deploying their services on the streets, there might be thousands of robots in the little area in the city, and they need to be regulated. There is also this e-scooter problem, bicycle problem, pedestrian problem, but I think we can't address everything with that standard. But in our case, the communication with a multi-vendor system, this is the thing what needs to be done.
Kevin, can I make a point on that?
Please do, yes, about to come to you. Please do.
I think there are perhaps three levels to this, really. The core level is the fact if we're going to have autonomous or automated vehicles on the footway, the software has to tell them what to do. Otherwise, they couldn't do what they. So the very minimum, there needs to be a set of rules or guidelines about what you do, and that will involve some protocols, maybe about whether you give way to something else or not. So that has to be a minimum, because you can't have things working unless you've got the software in there to tell them what to do. Then on top of that, we already have rules and regulations, particularly on the side, particularly at the footway, the curb side, where there are regulations about who can stop when, for how long, etc. So there's a second layer, which is at the moment mainly for people to interpret personally, but there are regulations they're supposed to follow. And there'll be other things, particularly on the footway, where people are going along or stopping to look in a window of a shop or something, or suddenly meet somebody, where you're not going to really regulate that at all. So I think maybe these things need breaking down into what we have to do just so that these things can operate, the other regulations that to some extent we can build in, and the things where we might encourage people to do certain things, but I don't think people are going to get fined if they suddenly stop to chat to somebody on the street.
Fine, thank you. Good answers. And a good question too. Thanks, Barry. Jerry, who else do we have in the questions?
Right. So, so I just want to encourage everybody on the line. Ask your questions. We're almost to the bottom of the questions already. So people are being a little bit shy, I think, about asking questions.
Others, there'll be more anecdotes about public toilets. We don't want that.
Yeah, I don't know. You scared them off, Kevin.
I've got several more.
But I've got some questions in case we run out. So, you know, Bern, you can get ready for that. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. So this is, sorry, the question is from Peroni Filho, Test Engineer QA Consultants. So compliance to ISO 4448 will no doubt require harmonizing with other relevant standards, depending on the particular application. Players already familiar with those additional standards will therefore have an easier time adopting ISO 4448 when it's published. What existing standards apply to mobile robots, such as autonomous snowplows, delivery robots, etc.?
We have to go to Andres for that one, I think. Andres, sorry, I'm straight on you, but you're a perfect person to answer that.
Bern, can you help me?
Okay,
so I can't help you with snowplows. I don't know a standard for those, or I'm certain there's local bylaws and so forth. So I leave that part to you. But I want to say in general, the standard, the 4448 is based on several existing standards, and those existing standards come from mapping, such as the Kerb LR standard is one of them, and there's a standard for parking that's under development, combining the standards from American parking standards, British Parking Association, and European Parking Association together. That group of standards is coalesced into a single standard called the APDS, the Parking Data Standard International, and the 4448 is based on that. Now that is talking about spaces where vehicles load and unload. That does not deal with the footpath. And for that, there's not international that I know of. There's not international standards. There's a lot of local standards about widths and so on. And somebody else pointed out, I think Peter pointed out earlier, that those vary from city to city because of cities having been developed over the last 5,000 years. We don't have a single reliable standard for all that. So the answer is we're doing our best to base it on as many standards as we can, and there's not enough to solve the problem. So there's going to be there's some edges to this that are still not solved. Andres, can you answer a little bit about service vehicles?
Yeah, for the street cleaning services for the winter time and in other seasons, there are the rules set by municipalities or by the countries. They're named road condition rules or regulations, and these are the things that municipal vehicles need to follow in every country. So, but they have no match with autonomous systems or anything. These are rules set for the street service companies.
Exactly.
Well, perhaps I can say one or two words on that. The way how we deal with it here, and at least in the Netherlands, if we want to implement these type of automated or autonomous systems, there is always the road municipality, the road authority, which is called the RDW, which tries to assess whether the system is actually safe. And currently they do that by the use of different ISO standards, as we call them. So one of the ISO standards they use, this is really on the vehicle side, is the ISO 26262. And this really assesses whether a certain functionality in the vehicle from a mechanical or a hardware point of view is actually doing what it is supposed to do. But this is, of course, not what we want to go to, because this is something that we are talking about in the now and theoretically, and has nothing to do with the use of artificial intelligence. In the case of artificial intelligence, this is, of course, the next step, that the autonomous robot is able to understand the world in such a sense that it is able to make decisions on its own and learn from let's say, past mistakes or past events. And this is a standard that is being developed currently by the European Union, which is the so-called ISO 21448, and it's abbreviated as SODIF, which is the safety of the intended functionality of a certain automated vehicle or autonomous vehicle. And this really looks at the fact, if a certain event occurs, what does the robot actually do? And if the robot does what it is intended to do, then it's okay. And this is actually looking at it from an artificial intelligence point of view. it becomes a lot more difficult, a lot more complex. And in my opinion, a standard will never be good enough, I would say, because the world is moving on. And actually, at some point, I think legislation is sometimes behind the facts. I don't know if others see it like that, but we're trying and we're doing our best. But actually, technology is going so fast that law and legislation and regulations are actually trying to keep up with the technology. And the final thing that I think is going to be a very important aspect is the use of cybersecurity. What if the connection and the connectivity between, in this case, a robot, or let's say an app, and the curbside is going to be hacked? And you can actually not reserve the system anymore, the curbside, but it is always going to be reserved by a certain person or a certain institution, and they hack the system. Well, these questions are something that we have not addressed yet, which cannot be addressed yet because we don't have a curbside with digital connection. But these are, of course, also questions that are starting to come to play, and yeah, they need a place as well.
Okay. Excellent.
If I can add very briefly that, just so you point out that it's very dynamic, standard will never be good enough, and one of the elements of an ISO process is that after the standard is published, it must be by ISO regulation, must be reviewed every 5 years. That issue of a 5-year renewal, which is good for many things, might not be sufficient for this, because this standard is going to be used to develop real-time communication systems, and those systems get updated monthly and weekly and quarterly and so on. So I don't know if a 5-year refresh cycle is going to be sufficient for this kind of a standard. I'm just pointing out that ISO is very sensitive to staying up to date, and there is a cycle for that might need to be updated more quickly, but the systems will be updated very frequently.
Can you
Yeah, exactly.
the idea that maybe that should be updated or at least reviewed yearly, but how do you make that happen? Is that something you can suggest to ISO, or is it, or would they just look at it and think this is not often enough?
So I'm sensitive to this, and yes, I will suggest it. There's no way I can, doing what I'm doing with ISO is a voluntary activity, and so there's no, it's not necessary that I can cause a change in that. What I can do when in writing this is to make sure that it's done in a way that the data and the protocol are sufficiently flexible, so that the actual application of that data and protocol would then still be within standard, but be able to be moved, be able to be adjusted by the systems that are actually using it. So there's going to be a bit of an art to this, and that's why, again, I underscore something I said at the beginning. That's why this standard needs to have many stakeholders, from developers of machines and municipalities and so on, so that the capability of the standard, its flexibility and its ability can actually withstand the kinds of changes and dynamic elements that we're expecting.
Yeah.
So very sensitive. It's a very difficult problem.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that? No? Okay. Jerry, do we have any more questions before we ask questions amongst ourselves?
Yeah, so before I move on to the next question, Barry Kirk also made a contribution that I wanted to share with everybody, and that is, what do you call a sidewalk washroom? It's a kiosk. Okay.
No.
I mentioned that now. Go on.
No.
Oh my goodness.
I know. I have other people to write my material. It's great.
Yeah.
All right. So
We're not going to steal that joke, Barry. You can have that one.
okay, so we're going to move on. I've got a question from Andrew Miller. What advantages, if any, will accrue to early adopters of the 4448 standard? Without such advantages, it's easy to imagine everyone waiting for everyone else to conform first, delaying widespread implementation significantly.
Good question. That's going to be for Bern.
Yeah, I want to. So I think there's two things. One thing is what's the advantage to adoption, but there's also what's the advantage to helping. What's the advantage to being involved as a stakeholder earlier? And I'm going to use the word influencing the standard. The obvious advantage of influencing the standards, you can make sure that the city that you're considering, or the machines that you're designing, or the processes that you're authoring, have the kind of support that you need and expect in the standard, so that if you have a standard that's published in 2 years from now and it doesn't satisfy your needs as any of those things, whether you're a planner or a manufacturer or a operator of these systems. So not being involved, if the standard doesn't serve your needs, that's a loss for you. So that early involvement is important. I think the other element, then that's addressing the, why wait, become involved earlier. I think that's the most important aspect to the answer. I'll stop there.
Okay. Anybody else want to contribute to that? Good answer, Ben.
Well, presumably the city owns the sidewalk. The city can actually say it will only authorise mobile vehicles on the sidewalk if they conform to certain standards, which would include that.
And oh, go ahead.
No.
Go ahead, Neluka.
Okay. Yeah, and another thing to that is, I guess I imagine that this would be, if I was a municipality, this would be rolled out, right? So you would select particular areas of your city that would be, targeted for adoption and the rollout of robots, right? And pilot that, see how it's working there. So I think if you're on the technical side, if you're an early adopter and you get involved in the earlier pilot, I think you have first to market essentially to be able to roll out your robots across other parts of the city ahead of everybody else, right? So you sort of take care of that piece.
Okay.
Well, I just want to add, there was no standard for where the ride-hailing vehicles would stop to board and passengers, or load and unload passengers. And now, some 7 or 8 years after the innovation of this technology of ride-hailing, we're finding cities adapting special loading zones and special one-off applications to sort this problem. It's not a standardized way, so each city they can read the newspaper and see what some other city does and say, oh, can we do something like that? There's no kind of standard way to express that, so each of those cities have to have the various ride-hailing companies modify their stop-off areas and so on, and that's a huge expense to all of those operators and all of those cities that have to figure that out one by one. If there had been a standard for that written 5 or 7 years ago, it would have made it easier for all of us, and the problem would have been headed off sooner than it's being headed off. And we can't let that happen in a expected world of robotic vehicles coming.
Sure.
Yeah. I fully agree, and I think actually that we need these early adopters. I mean, there are so many challenges. I mean, all of you just posed a couple of them. I mean, there's so many challenges that we need to solve that we haven't even touched upon. And without the use and without the help of these early adopters, how are we going to find out? And how are we going to set a standard if we don't face them? I mean, sometimes you have to just stumble, at least, in phases, of course, and smaller challenges. Don't make it too big, don't make it too large. But it's important that we all face these challenges, see them and address them, and see if we can fill them in a, like we call it, a standard. And we need early adopters for that.
Yeah. Andres, what's your thoughts? I've got a sort of a side question. Sorry, Neluka. The idea of using autonomous street drones or bots is fine in North America or large cities where you've got huge amounts of space, maybe Australia, South Africa as well. But you look at European cities, many European cities, their whole unique selling point is the fact they have narrow streets and almost no pavements. You go to parts of Italy or Malta where that's the reason people go, to see that kind of stuff. So are those cities excluded from this whole conversation? Because like I said, they shouldn't be, but it's very difficult to include them.
I think no.
I don't think.
because you can also use those kinds of robots to the bike lanes, and bike lanes they are heading out of the cities as well, and the same rules might apply to this kind of areas in the city as well, or a little bit outside of city.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that?
Well, I just think that there's sort of a potential for some co-benefits here, right? So as autonomous machines may sort of actually help us make the case that we need to reinvest in certain parts of our infrastructure of the city. So in the cases of more narrower streets in European cities, for example, and if that's more of a shared sort of space model, that's a good example where how they might operate in those places may be different than how they operate, in the North American highly segregated spaces. But I still think that it leads us to, like COVID did, an awareness that we have gaps and inadequacies in this infrastructure, and we can make the case and say, maybe we need wider sidewalks. If autonomous vehicles on the roadway, for example, might reduce the space requirements of normally required by automobiles, maybe we can be making that case, and cities may be in a better position for their constituents to say we need to reallocate some of that space over to the tables for the patios, and then therefore shift the sidewalk over, and therefore expand the sidewalk and make more bike lanes. So I think there's sort of all of those co-benefits that are quite possible.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just add to that? I think, as you said, in historic places in Britain, Italy or something, you're not probably going to widen the footway. But this raises an important point, actually, that I think it has the footway or sidewalk have been neglected, and we don't really have many regulations on there at the moment. So, for example, if you take people in a wheelchair, you ought to insist there's a minimum width of 800 centimetres or a metre that's always completely clear. So somebody in a wheelchair or somebody with a buggy can get by easily. That's not a regulation at the moment. So maybe this is also an opportunity to actually think about these wider things and make sure that we're catering for all, not just the autonomous vehicles, but even the things we have now, to start introduce standards to make people's life easier.
Yeah, those minimum widths are included. The standard doesn't say what the width is. The standard doesn't say it's 0.8 or 1.3. The standard provides for a minimum width. The city or the local area has to say what that width is. And the standard will say the minimum possible width is something, but the standard provides a range. It doesn't set the actual number. That number has to be set locally.
Yeah, but my point is, at the moment, we aren't really doing that in many cases, whereas this is an opportunity to think much more comprehensively and make sure we're giving a better level of service to everybody on the footway.
That's right.
Stimulated by this, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Okay, excellent. Thank you for that, guys. We've got 2.5 minutes left. So, Jerry, do we have a quick question, or do we perform the song we've all learned?
Let's try and squeeze one more question in from Jari Honkanen. Let's see. It's to everyone, especially Ahmed. Is there existing examples of policy guidelines or design guides for city planners that takes this topic into account?
Well, actually, I'm not the expert on that, I have to be honest, but we as Future Mobility Network, we do that. My colleague, Iris Reis, who was in the previous webinar, is our expert on that. Standards, I don't think so, but we try to set this standard and this way of thinking actually into the minds of city planners and urban planners, such that they see how to translate and how to embed this type of smart mobility, sidewalk curbs, connected curbs into the existing urban environment. So yes, we are working on it, but regarding the standards, I'm not so sure. I don't think so, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Anybody else?
I think, yeah, I mean, there are lots of guidelines about how to lay out footways and curbs and so on, but they're not standards.
No.
And then some of those now people are starting to think about autonomous vehicles. So NATO, for example, has done quite a lot of work around design standards for footways, curbs, running lanes, and have started to do work about how autonomous vehicles might fit into that. But I think in the sense more of guidelines for people to think about rather than regulation.
Yeah, excellent. Right, in that case, we've come to the end of our hour, almost to the second. Nicely timed, everybody. So thank you to all our panelists, to Ahmed, Andres, Peter, Neluka, obviously Bern and Jerry, and for myself. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to listen and to watch the conversation. Interesting stuff, some good questions, some nice answers, and of course some of the answers are thrown up even more questions, which we'll look to answer in a future webinar. Bern, we have another one coming up in a few weeks' time. I'm going to briefly, before our time ends, tell the viewers and listeners what's next.
Yeah, what's next? I believe it's August the 5th. We're still settling that date, and we're still setting the panel, but that will be focused on monetizing the automated curb. So all these kinds of things we're talking about doing, some of those things that are going to be happening will be monetized. That we're not saying which ones and that sort of thing, but there is an implication of monetization, and the implication is the standard would enable that as well as safety and other kinds of things. So very important subject.
Excellent. So 5th of August 2020. Join us again in 4 weeks' time. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank you
everyone.
all.
Bye. Bye.